So thanks everybody for being here this afternoon on a beautiful, sunny, almost spring day in Washington. It's been gloomy, so I thank you for lifting the fog and rain and clouds from DC. So I wanted to say that first off that I'm a deep believer in cultural diplomacy. I actually wouldn't exist but for cultural diplomacy. My parents actually met when my father was on a Fulbright. He was in Norway studying Norwegian immigration to the United States, and my mother, who's French, was teaching French in Norway. And they fell in love in the library, which I guess is appropriate for a couple of academics. But so here we are. And my siblings and I are ever grateful for the Fulbright program, for having brought them together. And the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is also, I just want to recognize how significant the work is that it does. It's clear that in the world that we live in now, there's not only more interdependency and contact between nations, but there has to be. It's both exists and it needs to be more so. Between the importance of the variety of trade contacts and what you've heard about in terms of the opera. It's obviously an important part of this exchange. But with social media and so forth, in the effort to ensure global peace and stability, we have to take these exchanges and interactions and make them as positive as we can. The Institute has identified a number of different kinds of exchanges and interactions that are important. Obviously the academic exchanges that I've mentioned, and I have personally not only benefited from my parents, but also took part in a number of such exchanges myself when I was in law school, when I was in college, and then subsequently I was a Bosch Fellow in Germany for a year. And I know how vital those types of personal connections are, and keeping the vibrancy of international relations going, because as people often say in different contexts, the personal is political, but often those kinds of personal relationships are really incredibly important to correcting and identifying conflicts as they are incipient, as they're growing, that can actually be really helped by people who have an understanding of another culture and a personal relationship with somebody they can talk to. But as we look at those kinds of exchanges, I think we often look at the cultural and the academic, and even to legislative. The Germans also have the Bundes fellowship, with young people come and having an experience with the American Congress. Those are all really vital. But I think what often gets forgotten is the judicial branch. As a lawyer and somebody who works with judges and lawyers and many wonderful law firms like Squire Patton Boggs, I think this is a vital piece of the puzzle. And so I want to, just talk a little bit about the American experience and how it relates. You might have heard, especially because of the musical of one of our founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton. But besides singing and dancing, he actually participated in drafting our Constitution. And he said something really important about the judiciary, which is, he called it the least dangerous branch. What he meant by that is, unlike the other branches of government, it does not have the purse. That is, on the legislative side, they decide who gets money, or the sword, the executive branch with the army. The courts and rule of law really function by trust and respect. And so it is really significant that they have those things in a democracy. Otherwise, it cannot function. And in our system, like many others, the courts play the vital role of judicial review. And that means that they get to decide. The courts decide whether the actions of the executive or legislative branch violate the law or the Constitution. And even though our Constitution doesn't actually lay this out, it was very early in the history of the United States in 1803, actually, when Justice John Marshall of our Supreme Court in a famous decision called Marbury versus Madison said that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. And really that was so formative because it wasn't ever really challenged in our system that that was right. I mean, it's kind of embedded in the structure, in the separation of powers, that that is the role of the courts. And that has been very much of an influence on other countries around the world as they have looked to the United States as an example. And our courts have been a central player in some very controversial debates throughout American history over slavery, over what freedom of speech means, what is access to the ballot box, and women's reproductive rights, among many other really important issues. And already in 1835, Alexis de Tocqueville observed in his book Democracy in America, another sort of cultural diplomacy of sorts, but he said there's almost no political question in the United States that's not resolved sooner or later into a judicial question. And that is even more true today. Not to get into too much politics here, but is in the situation that we find ourselves in right now in the United States, where we face a number of crises and conflicts over issues like immigration, potential self-dealing by our executive, and the very likely infiltration of our election system by a foreign power. We're looking to the courts even more as an important rule of law factor. And all of this is sort of, well, how does this all relate to cultural diplomacy? Well, an independent and accountable and well-functioning judiciary is a central pillar of rule of law. And the link between rule of law and democratic governance is essential. And the UN defines rule of law this way. It says the rule of law refers to a principle of governance in which all persons, institutions, and entities, public and private, including the state itself, are accountable to laws publicly promulgated, equally enforced, independently adjudicated, which are consistent with international human rights norms and standards. And that is the characteristics of that rule of law can be seen to be adherence to the principles of supremacy of the law. The law is above all, above the executive, above the elected officials. Equality before the law for all people. Fairness in application. A separation of powers. Again, that's the judiciary and their role. Participation in decision-making. Legal certainty. That is, nobody can upend the law because they choose to. And avoidance of arbitrariness and procedural and legal transparency. These are critical factors to democracy and democratic governance. And what you find in the way that it's been articulated by the UN and others is that it's a universal principle. It's not Western, it's not European, it's not American. And I think the Albanian example was a wonderful one where people who have very different backgrounds and different religions all share the common understanding of the universal principles behind rule of law. So that you can have countries that have different traditions, religious or customary components, and even where religious law is the foundation for family and other laws. But the principle of rule of law is going to transcend all of those other differences. And thus, I think one of the ways that sort of this is the role of courts and judges in cultural diplomacy is that because this is a universal principle, that it's not a foreign influence. It is, in fact, something that grows out of every society and that should be applied in every society. And there can be common understandings about how those concepts can be applied to certain circumstances. And that's why when you see positive reforms that happen in many countries, it's often when they look outward and say, how do we learn from others in trying to ensure that we have rule of law here at home, even as we might adapt to our own native institutions. And sometimes in those circumstances, and oftentimes, we learn how we ourselves fall short. And I as my experience, certainly whether I was a Bosch Fellow I was looking at German employment and labor law. That's actually my background before I went to the Hill and did all of those other things. And I studied American and German labor law. My father was a historian, and he studied comparative history between the United States and other countries on race. And so from both my personal experience and my professional experience, I know that we learn both about these universal principles and how important they are, but also where we fall short and where we're strong, because that kind of comparative analysis is a vital piece of understanding how to improve where we are. So in terms of the courts and judges, they function in that circumstance. The judges and lawyers can be incredible ambassadors for greater independence, accountability, and transparency in judicial systems. And we've seen many international and national institutions that have partnered in helping to draft and implement codes of judicial ethics, promoting judicial education and training, and helping to enhance court administration and efficiency. Because when we see when these types of training and education programs fall short, as well as when there's not sufficient emphasis on judicial ethics, there's a real hindrance to rule of law. When judges are overwhelmed with caseloads, when there's not enough resources allocated to the court systems, when they're not modern case management systems, all of that can result in procedural delays that undermine administration of justice, as well as can lead to corruption. And all those factors really undermine the public trust in the judiciary system. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that is the issue that Alexander Hamilton identified, which is the trust is what it makes it work. It doesn't work for any other reason except that people in the society believe that their courts are going to administer justice to them. It's even-handed. It's the balance that everybody gets a fair shot at having justice in the courtroom. And without it, the whole democratic project starts to crumble. And there's no real better example of that than in the criminal justice area, where there is really, an extreme importance that countries learn from each other about how to have fair systems that are free from bias and that have enhanced rights protections for the accused and victims alike. That these kinds of trainings for judges and lawyers are really critical to have strong public defender systems, as well as prosecutors who understand what the restraints are on the power of the state. This is important on a range of issues, from organized crime, money laundering, terrorism financing, but also domestic violence and gender-based violence. And all of these are really critical to keep communities safe. So I see that judicial diplomacy is really a critical factor of cultural diplomacy. Collaborative action and communication among national courts, and usually the highest judicial bodies. And one of the most famous examples of this, of judicial diplomacy, was in Europe, where the interaction of national judges was actually a critical factor in European integration, and where exchanges among judges, lawyers, and law schools around the legal issues facing Europe really helped resolve the direction that the EU would go in. And so I just want to mention that in that light, there are some issues of real concern right now in Europe, in particular in Poland, where they have been, the parliament has been focused on legislation that would really hamper judicial independence. And the parliament adopted two draft laws, the lower house, that would actually force most of the Supreme Court into retirement. So basically clear the decks and give the ruling party control over the judicial appointments. It's a very frightening prospect for a member of the EU to be moving in this direction. And as a result, the Council of Europe's legal advisory body, the Venice Commission, has stated that these proposed amendments put at risk, at serious risk, the independence of all parts of the Polish judiciary. And they've invoked Article 7 of the Treaty of the European Union for the first time, which could actually lead to the country losing its voting rights. It is a grave danger to democracy. Authoritarian states can be governed either by law or by personal power or loyalty. And that is the danger that we face with what Poland is facing. Democracies, on the other hand, require the rule of law. And so I think it is a vital issue for all of us who care about rule of law and democracy to pay attention what happens there. We're living in fraught times. I think we all probably feel, I certainly feel a lot of stress these days about what's happening in the world, what's happening in the United States. And so that's why cultural diplomacy, I think, it's so vital right now, more vital than it might have ever been. And it is something that requires more than academic exchanges and opera singers going to other countries. As important as that is, I don't want to say that that's not really important. And I'd love to go to Albania someday myself, although I don't sing. But the judiciary and the legal profession are a really, really vital part of that. And I actually have been part of several exchanges through the U.S. State Department along those lines. My organization, the American Constitution Society, has hosted several fellows from Eastern Europe, from the former Soviet republics, who've spent time with us to observe how we do our work, to understand the American legal system so that they can go home and help build civil society. I myself have gone to Georgia, met with the Ministry of Justice and lawyers and members of their Supreme Court. And I think it's just an incredibly important part of the work that we do. It's not just to focus on the United States, but to understand our role in the world. And so I just want to, close with one thought from Aristotle. I open with Alexander Hamilton, but I'll go back a little further. And he said that the only stable state is the one in which all men, and I would say, and women, are equal before the law. And that is, I think, a role that you all play in cultural diplomacy, is ensuring that we do have that assurance that we are all equal before the law. So thank you very much. Happy to take any questions. I don't know.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions for Carol, please?
Yes. For you?
Why don't we start this gentleman
Okay.
here hasn't had a chance.
Okay.
Excuse me. I'm coming from Afghanistan, you see. Women violence rate in Afghanistan so high. Do you think that there are other countries like European country and the United States and any other development countries, there are women violence?
Women, violence against women? Absolutely, violence against women is a problem everywhere in the world. And it is one of the big issues that faces legal systems now, is how to protect women, how to ensure that there are appropriate punishments. But also what is very important, even here in the United States, is that women are often afraid to come forward. So the initial problem is to create an environment where women don't fear for their lives simply to complain about being treated violently. So there are a lot of preconditions, and there are organizations, both domestically here in the United States, but also internationally, who've developed many protocols for how to assist women in coming forward to provide, I think what's essential initially is a safe environment. And so, countries are at different stages, but there are many resources to help guide both organizations that help the women directly, but also the legal systems to have a process to ensure that there is some kind of a remedy.
Equal treatment by the law for women and men. Do you think any problem in the developing country?
Well, there's a problem in every country on that, so, we're all trying to move forward, but yes, I mean,
United States as well.
including the United States, and I could cite you many, but I don't know if you want to.
You had a question there in the back. I want to get everybody in order. You had a question, right?
Yes,
Yep.
I did. Thank you for your notes there. Judicial diplomacy, this is the first time that I'd ever heard the term.
Yes.
And it really speaks to me because it has a direct impact on improving judiciaries
Mhm.
in other states. I think one of the strengths in cultural diplomacy is that it's soft, the softer of the soft powers,
Mhm.
so it's non-threatening. So when you share, you have a cultural exchange, there's less of a threat, right? When I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking of my mother country, Cambodia, where the judiciary is directly impacted by the executive branch, and it's quite problematic there. I'm thinking of how judicial diplomacy might be implemented in a case like that, where the resistance, historically has been quite strong. And so what are some
Mhm.
approaches that we could take in judicial diplomacy
Mhm.
towards belligerent states?
Well, so I mean, that's obviously, a complex issue, but I think initially there are opportunities for exchanges of the type, that are often, done with academic exchanges. But I know many American judges travel through our Federal Judicial Center has a program to collaborate with other countries. So having an opportunity for somebody to give a talk, to meet with judges, to start with the kind of soft power, in education, as well as ensuring that Cambodian judges can be invited to other countries to participate in the same kind of conversations. I think that's really vital. But I think the other piece is as people become more educated and understand that rule of law is not just, I mean, obviously it has a high moral value. It's important for many reasons, but there's actually real economic reasons for it generally, that, there's, having an assurance that your contract is going to be enforced. You enter into, a contract, and if the other person doesn't abide by it, you can go to the court and have it enforced. Without those kinds of rule of law assurances in that economic sense. So I think there's many parts of it that require education, that it has many benefits, that there are human rights benefits, of course, but that there are also all of these other residual benefits that I think for people who may not be as excited about the human rights component, I think can be effective. But I do think that that those kinds of personal exchanges are really vital here. And I know a lot of the judges that I talk to have really found it, from their perspective, incredibly wonderful experience to be able to be invited to speak to other judges in other countries. And so I think, there's obviously, more that needs to be done for belligerent states, but I think that's at least, I think that really is a very important piece of it.
My name is Zero. I have a quick question regarding reparations. We know there was some agreement when Germany was able to pay reparations of 89 billion to this point. Is there any way that international courts could demand certain governments or countries or nations to pay restitution or reparations to countries that suffer genocide, whether it be Australia or fight slavery, or South Africa?
It's a
for example?
big question. There are other people who are much more expert than I am in international law, but I do think that when countries pay reparations, it's always because they've decided to and not because someone has ordered them to. But I would defer to others who are no doubt much more expert in this. But I think the German government after World War II had to make many reparations, and they both had to from a, because they were the loser in World War II, but then they also needed to for their own kind of status and moral culpability. I think the circumstances are very different for other countries that, may be morally culpable in many ways, but there's not the leverage. So anyway, many of you probably know better than I do, but.
We have one more question.
This is really, I add both this one as this is also, I first time heard the judicial diplomacy word even. I testify in Congress Foreign Affairs Committee just 2 weeks ago. Congressman asked me in Foreign Affairs Committee that if we want to go in Pakistan, can you recommend 2-3 people whom we can meet? Actually, I suggest that meet the judges.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, in the third world countries, especially in Pakistan, thousands of people are disappearance. And the court is, the judges, they're trying, but I think, I really recommend Mr. Mark, maybe with the cultural diplomacy, you have to aid this judicial diplomacy, because like you mentioned, the justice has that trust, and that is the only institute can maybe bring the real things, which is kind of the justice and all. We are lucky here, there's a rule of law in it, but third world country, rule of law, bribe, other things are killing and terrorism, so much issues. Beside the soft diplomacy, judicial diplomacy really kind of, this is, I would say, outcome of this your conference is really this kind of the idea or thoughts which can be very, very helpful, especially the third world country. That's my.
Well, thank you. And I'd have to say, Pakistan is such an interesting country because it faces many of the same problems as other developing countries, and yet the judiciary has been very strong, surprisingly strong in facing some of the challenges, and has numerous, and the lawyers have had strikes and walkouts and protest, and I know it's way more complicated than that, but the little that I've seen, it's been very interesting to see the kind of rule of law demonstrations by the lawyers in Pakistan that really are stand out because of how brave they are.
I want to talk about Afghanistan. You see, even in Pakistan, they have the right to demonstrate the judiciary demonstration. But in Afghanistan, you see, the deputy president of Afghanistan was arrested to smuggling $52 million in the white. But no one asked him. Now we have the deputy president. He is a criminal. And there are many criminals that nowadays they are in the top of the Afghan government. If the judiciary diplomacy is applicable, then start from Afghanistan. I think the best country is Afghanistan. Pakistan, they are so developed compared to Afghanistan.
Right. We'll start there
It all
then.
depends on where you sit.
Yes,
Thank you
all
so
right.
much.
Well, thank you.
Fascinating.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Great meeting, welcome. Thank you.